Hello and welcome to KARE 11 On the Record. I'm political reporter Danny Spiewak. There are a number of statewide offices on the ballot in Minnesota in 2026, and that includes one that a lot of people haven't talked about yet. That's the Office of State Auditor, who oversees about $60 billion in local government spending. One of the nominees vying for the Republican nomination for auditor this year is Dr. Scott Jensen. Of course, he represented the GOP as the nominee for governor back in 2022. This time, he's making his run for auditor.
Well, Dr. Jensen, welcome to KARE 11, and thanks for taking the time. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So until recently, you were going to run for the Republican nomination for governor, but you've decided to switch to state auditor. Tell us about that decision. Why run for auditor now?
When my wife and I and our campaign team made the decision to run for governor last summer, it was right after I'd had a surgery on my neck where they did a fusion of two of the vertebrae. I recovered wonderfully. I was extremely grateful. And we felt that we would be the strongest candidate to defeat Tim Walz in the November 26 election. In that time frame, we are also encouraged to think about some of the other positions that we're going to have elections in November of 26, particularly the U.S. Senate race. And we made a decision that we really did want to run against Tim Walz in the November election. In early January, when the tumult regarding all the fraud sort of hit a boiling point and Tim Walz withdrew, that changed the calculus for me as well. Because I know that Republicans like to celebrate the fact that they don't buy into identity politics, but I think there's a certain reality that can't be denied. And when Amy Klobuchar announced that she was going to run, I felt like I'm not certain that I would be the strongest candidate for the Republican Party to defeat her in November. So that, along with the fact that we still had a dozen candidates still in the race and we weren't getting any coalescence, that was frustrating thousands of folks. And at the same time, I was being asked to consider running for other positions. And so basically in the month of January, there was a lot of soul searching. And I made the decision with my wife and ultimately my campaign team that I would want to run for state auditor. Almost all the fraud and waste that's really been highlighted over the last many years, and particularly over the last 6 months, has taken place in the arena of human services and healthcare. And that's where I live every day.
Obviously, you finished fairly low in the straw poll for governor. How much did that play into the decision? Did you feel you didn't have a path to win for governor? And is that partly why you decided to go for the auditor job?
KSTP had a couple big polls, and so did the private business partnership from September of 25 through January of 26. And in all three of those polls, the audience was predominantly likely voters in the primary in August of 26 or in the general election. And in every one of those polls, I was leading all the other Republican candidates. However, in the straw polls, which are much smaller, much more focused potentially on a given single or secondary issue, I wasn't doing as well. So it was clear to me that some of the hardcore 5-yard line Republicans struggled with me. They felt like I hadn't been willing to come alongside them on all the issues that they wanted me to. So I could feel that erosion on the straw polls.
One of your opponents on the Republican side for auditor, Representative Engen, said this move in some fashion. He called it desperation, I believe was the word he used. What would you say to those who believe that you're just looking for an office to win and not necessarily running for the job?
Well, at the most basic level, what we're talking about is public service. So I think sometimes people at some point in time in their lives decide that they want to do public service. It might be because they think they have something to contribute and they can solve problems. It might be because they're looking for a career change. It might be because they're looking for a stepping stone to something else. I don't think a 71-year-old is really looking for a stepping stone, and I'm not looking for a career change. I'm in love with being a family doc. I do think that I have a broad understanding of what the state auditor does. So I heard the comment too, and I dismissed it as sort of an in-the-moment kind of comment that maybe Representative Engen, it caught him off guard, and he made that comment. I think he also made a comment about what it is to be a perennial loser or something like that. And I think in my life, whether you look at school board elections, Senate elections, gubernatorial elections, primary elections, I think I bat 90%. I think I've lost once in my entire life, and I've won many, many elections. So I think a single loss doesn't define what I would consider a perennial loser, because Representative Engen himself has lost in races, as has Tom Emmer, Norm Coleman, Rudy Boschwitz, Abraham Lincoln, Donald Trump. I mean, the list goes on. So if everybody who lost one election was to be disqualified from running and committing themselves to public service, that would seem sort of silly.
Looking at the role of the state auditor position, obviously it oversees about $60 billion in local spending. I know you've talked a lot about fraud, but it doesn't really have a direct oversight of state programs. How would you look at local governments as is your jurisdiction? How would you have oversight of those?
I think a lot of people are missing how to look at the data that the state auditor will have available. First, the state auditor is in charge of first-class cities or Class 1 cities in Minnesota. So the state auditor is responsible for doing the audit for any city over 100,000. And right now we have 3 of those. We have Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Rochester. So that's the state auditor. You also, as a state auditor, as of 2021, you're obligated and given the opportunity to do the single statewide audit of federal funds. And then you do all 87 counties in terms of looking over those. Well, if you know that the federal government is getting to Minnesota $2 billion for program XYZ, and you can look at all 87 counties and see where they're getting or how much money they're getting regarding program XYZ, and you can also look at Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Rochester, you have a pretty good idea of what's come into Minnesota and what's been distributed. And if you have $2 billion coming in and you can only find $1.5 billion, you have to ask the question, where's the other $500 million? That's the information and the question you would direct to the legislative auditor and say, please look at the state agencies that have access to these dollars, because we're missing $500 million. And if you look at the performance of the legislative auditor over the last decades, powerfully capable, with integrity. Jim Nobles did a remarkable job for decades and decades. So there's an opportunity to help there and to shine a bright light on it. Also, there's fraud occurring at county levels, and particularly your Class 1 cities. Minneapolis and St. Paul has absolutely been victimized by fraud and embezzlement and waste. I think the other thing that really comes to play is many Minnesotans are aware of the fact that Hennepin County Medical Center is in trouble financially. This has been written about for months and months, but things are coming to a crescendo. Where has the state auditor been over the last 8 years in terms of auditing Minneapolis, looking at how many dollars are going there, auditing Hennepin County, looking at how many dollars are going to help support Hennepin County Medical Center?
Would you support the legislature passing a law that would expand the scope of the auditor's office to have more direct oversight of programs and fraud at the state level?
I would want to work with the legislature as well as the commissioner of MMB, the governor, and also the office of the legislative auditor, because arguably most large companies will have internal controls, and oftentimes one of the first things you'll do on an internal control is dual authorization. Many folks wonder, what does that mean? Well, if you open an app on your phone, frequently it'll say, okay, we understand you want to open this, but this is a dual program. You have to have another way, so we'll either send you a push, call you, or send you a text. Which do you want? We need to do the same thing with auditing Minnesota books. And what that would mean to me is, if the Office of the Legislative Auditor is going to continue to take primary responsibility for the state agencies, that's fine. But make certain that the state auditor gets a chance to sign off on that as well. Because then you would have the state auditor doing the feds, the state agencies, the counties, the cities, and other municipalities that would tap into that, such as towns and school districts. I think there would be greater confidence that someone's getting a chance to see the whole playing field. Right now, we might be guilty in Minnesota of sort of parsing it out a little too much. I also would support having the Office of the Legislative Auditor have access to what the state auditor is doing more widely, so that the legislative auditor is ready to go to the legislature and say, between what we're doing and what the state auditor is doing, here's some problems.
I'll ask you a broader question,
Sure.
just looking at the Republican Party in Minnesota in general. I remember your speech from 2022, the night of the election, and you had mentioned something about the party needing to recalibrate. What has changed in 4 years in your mind that you believe puts Republicans in a position to finally win a statewide race? Because it's been 20 years.
That's a good question, Danny. The Republican Party does need to recalibrate. And unfortunately, the middle of the party probably sees that more readily. I think people in the Republican Party that will hold on to a single issue, frequently that single issue may well have already been settled. I think the Republican Party declares that it's the party of limited government. But it seems like it's the party of limited government only so far as it's convenient for the Republican Party. People want to make their own personal private decisions. Historically, the Republican Party has supported that. It seems now that the Republican Party frequently will raise up and say, well, hold it now, we're not entirely comfortable with this, or this decision, so we will introduce legislative activity into this area. We've got to stop doing that. We need to recalibrate. What people really want out of the Republican Party is they want the Republican Party to stand up for the workers, to stand up for responsible administration of programs. They want better legislation. They want legislation that's not half-baked. They want legislation that has built into it some obstacles for fraudsters. They want us to do a better job legislating instead of throwing mud on the wall, seeing what sticks, and then hoping that there aren't too many loopholes by which fraudsters might take advantage of a given program or a given new legislation. We need to stop it at the front end and go in on offense. We can play the blame game all day long, but quite frankly, fraud has been going on for more than just 6 or 7 years. Clearly, it's gotten sloppy over the last 5 or 6 years. But you could go back and see that Jim Nobles, the legislative auditor, has been pointing out problems with internal controls and external controls for decades. So from my perspective, there is no question the Republican Party needs to offer people what they want, and that would be 1, good governance, 2, limited governance, 3, stay out of our personal issues as much as you can, because people want to make those decisions on their own. And I think we're seeing Gen Zs and millennials speak strongly, saying, don't do this. We'll support you as long as you stay out of my private life. I understand that. And I think the Republican Party has to understand that as well. If we don't recalibrate, we're going to keep on losing.
When you talk about personal decisions, are you referring at all to abortion rights, which of course was a big deal in 2022 with your campaign?
I think we need to recognize that 2 things can be true. You can be personally pro-life, as I am. My wife and I had to struggle to have a family. But I think you can also recognize that based on state Supreme Court decisions, legislative statutes, that in Minnesota from a policy perspective is a pro-choice state, and any bill passed to the contrary will be virtually immediately identified as being unconstitutional. Strong pro-life organizations have acknowledged that any type of abortion ban would be dismissed as unconstitutional because of Doe v. Gomez in 1995.
All right, Dr. Jensen, thanks for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Welcome back. The top election official in Minnesota is Secretary of State Steve Simon. He's running for re-election himself as a Democrat here in 2026, but he's also responsible for administering the election in Minnesota. We sat down with him to talk about some of his concerns ahead of the midterms due to some of the rhetoric around elections from President Trump.
Well, Secretary, thanks for joining us here. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So you'll be testifying about the potential federal impact on the 2026 midterms here in Minnesota. But what is your level of concern about Trump administration actions toward Minnesota?
Well, let me start with what they haven't done. The Trump administration so far has really disappointed secretaries of state across the country by seeming to retreat from the mission of helping us to administer elections And I want to give credit where it's due. In Trump 1.0, in the first Trump administration, they were excellent allies, really, really good and solid. For whatever reason, they appear to have backed away from that mission. So secretaries of state like me and those in other states have had to go their own way in seeking alliances, partnerships, and services that we previously had counted on the federal government to help us with, and they're not. That's on what they aren't doing. In terms of what they are doing, and I want to be very careful how I word this, we have an all-hazards approach when it comes to elections in our office, right? We have teammates across the state. Our votes are counted, for example, in communities across Minnesota, in townships and cities, and in counties. There are friends and neighbors doing counting. And what I'm concerned about is what we're having to prepare for. So we always prepare for things like a power outage or a bomb threat or a weather event, things that we're not predicting will happen, but we have to responsibly take precautions for. And sadly, in 2026, we are having to add to that bucket or that list the possibility that the federal government will in some way, either directly or even indirectly, interfere with an orderly administration of an election. Again, I'm not predicting that will happen, but there's a non-zero chance, and enough of a chance, that we really need to game out those various scenarios. And we are, just as we do with the bomb threat, just as we do with a weather event. And so sadly, that's a fact of life right now. I hope it doesn't come to pass, but we've had to reach out to partners nationally and within Minnesota and across with our colleagues and other secretaries of state, just to be thinking about that. What might that look like, and how might we respond if, even indirectly, there's something in the path of voters being able to vote?
What do you interpret the president as saying when he talks about potentially wanting to nationalize elections?
Well, that's up to him, but what he seems to be objecting to is certain policies that he doesn't like at the state level, and that's his right, and he can not like them. But our Constitution's really clear. The Constitution says that, elections are the purview of the states, that states are in charge of the time, place, and manner of elections, except, it says, Congress can step in. Congress can pass a law if they don't like what states are doing. Here, what the president so far seems to be suggesting is that he and he alone, through executive orders, for example, can sort of wave a magic wand in the Oval Office and start taking over elections. And the Constitution is silent about that. It does not give him that ability. So he may want to nationalize or take over what the states do, but the Constitution really couldn't be much more clear. And I'm pretty confident, as we've already seen, that the courts and others will push back against any attempt to do that.
Yeah, of course, the Trump administration has sued for more voter records in Minnesota.
Right.
From your vantage point, from your perspective, why are you against giving up those records to the Trump administration?
Well, our position on that starts and ends with the law, not our preferences, not who we like or don't like, but simply the four corners of the actual law. And Minnesota, by the way, is not alone. We're not some sort of island of defiance out there. 32 states, including Minnesota, have said, no, we're not going to give in to a demand to hand over private and personal data records. And the reason we and the other 31 states feel that way is our read of the actual law, both the federal law and the laws within our states, say that under these circumstances, they are not entitled to obtain and demand this kind of very sensitive personal information. And just for your viewers, they're not talking about name and address. That's public. In fact, our office sells that for $46 to candidates, campaigns, political parties, and the like. What they want is Social Security information, driver's license information, and the like, really sensitive information. And so we and 31 other states are looking at the law, and we don't think that they're entitled to that. And so we're in court. And by the way, that's exactly where we should be. In a civilized democracy, when you have a dispute about the law and what the law says, you don't fight it out in the streets, you go to a court of law. And that's what we're doing, and that's the way that we're going to settle this. And of course, at the end of the day, we'll abide by whatever the court says. But we're making our arguments, they're making theirs, but we just don't think the law entitles them to get this personal private data. And then zooming out a little bit more, they haven't said to us or the other states that they're suing, they haven't said what precisely is the need. Why in particular do they need things like Social Security data, driver's license data? And then on the other end, they also haven't said what in particular they plan to do with it. Who will they share it with? How will it be transmitted, stored, kept, secured? For what purpose will they use it? So in light of all that, we are joining again with 31 other states saying, no, the Department of Justice doesn't just get to ask for and demand sensitive private information on Minnesota voters or voters in other states.
Have you spoken with any members of the Minnesota Republican congressional delegation? They proposed a bill that would take election funding away from Minnesota if they don't comply.
Right. Well, we've exchanged some letters, and I know some of those folks. I served with them when I was in the Minnesota House, and we have a good civil relationship, but we just disagree on this one. And I think that's a really flawed approach. As I mentioned, there are 32 states total who have said no to the Justice Department. That's a pretty heavy majority of states that have said no, the law doesn't entitle you to. But in no other state have members of their congressional delegation, in essence, threatened to cut off federal funds to a state if their Secretary of State didn't give in to the Justice Department demand. So that's not done in Iowa, that's not done in Ohio or West Virginia or any other of the other 32 states that are taking the same legal position as us. And apart from that, whether someone has done it or not, I'm failing to understand why a response to disagreeing with the legal position would be to starve your own constituents of valuable federal election funds, right?
Switching gears to the SAVE Act, the president has made that a priority of his, and it's stalling in Congress due to what's going on in the Senate.
Right.
But what's your position on what the impact of that could be on Minnesota if it were to pass?
Well, here's the practical thing about something like the SAVE Act. And I understand why on the surface of it, it has a lot of appeal, right? It would impose a documentary proof of citizenship requirement for the first time in American history. In other words, you've got to show papers demonstrating that they're U.S. citizen. And I understand the appeal of that, but when you look at how it will be actually implemented, there's some real troubling aspects. For example, we have about 69 million women in America who have a different last name now than the one they were born with, almost always due to marriage. So what do you do if you're in that situation? Well, if you have something like a passport, you're good to go because a passport is a document that proves U.S. citizenship. But we have tens of millions of those women who don't have a passport. So then what would you do? Well, the answer is you would probably have to produce both a birth certificate and a marriage record. And if you've been married more than once, it would be more than one marriage record. Now, this isn't just theoretical, by the way. In the state of Kansas, about 15 years ago, they passed a state-level version of the SAVE Act. In other words, they said to their voters, before you can vote, you have to show papers, an actual document demonstrating U.S. citizenship. And in that election, more than 26,000 Kansans were shut out. Eligible Kansans, I should point out, just like you and me, born, raised, American as apple pie, and they were shut out, fenced out, and denied the right to vote. And we're, 2.5 times the size of Kansas, so you can do the math in Minnesota. So while I completely understand the surface level appeal of this, I think members of Congress have to really think through in a hard way how this would actually be implemented. And that's my chief concern.
Whether it's the SAVE Act or just even more broadly talking about just voter ID, obviously that's been a conversation for years in various states and here as well. Polling largely shows that Americans support voter ID stipulations and they support having that at the polls. How do you square that with some of the concerns that you have? Because people support the idea of it.
Yeah, well, just to level set, in Minnesota, in order to even get into the system, to register to vote before you even vote, you have to show two things. You are who you say you are, and you live where you say you live, both things. So it's identity plus residency. However, in Minnesota for a long time, and in many states, we have a broad and flexible list of things that you can use to show either or both of those, not only a state-issued photo ID from the government. And so that approach has served us really well in Minnesota. It's the good and right balance, I think, between access and security. Minnesotans voted on this not too long ago. We had a statewide election about whether Minnesotans wanted to adopt a statewide mandatory government-issued photo ID requirement. And by a pretty good margin, Minnesotans said no. And it was pretty a diverse no. It was in rural areas, suburban, urban, et cetera. And I think, at least my read of why Minnesotans didn't back that is it's one of those examples of where the more you look, the less you like. I'll give you one example. So if you go into, and I've done this, a senior or assisted living facility, and you take a straw poll or a flash poll, and you say, raise your hand if you have a state-issued, government-issued photo ID that is current that shows this address, not the home where you moved here from, this address. And in all the times I've done that over the years, I've never gotten to 50%. It's just an example of where something with understandable surface appeal might, in the implementation, be really difficult and challenging for a lot of people.
On that same topic or similar topic, at least, talking about just sort of the voter protections that you have in terms of people who are who they say they are. This came up last fall, I believe, when you testified in front of the House Fraud Committee related to non-citizens voting.
Right.
What protections are currently in place in Minnesota to prevent that from happening? There are a lot of questions that were put your way in that.
Right. So we have a lot of protections built into state law before, during, and after elections. We are constantly, for example, sometimes daily in our office, screening and filtering every single voter registration through multiple databases, whether that's databases that are trying to sniff out non-citizens, immigration data, criminal justice data. Believe it or not, we sift all the voter records in Minnesota, all the millions of them, through not one but two death databases. There's one federal and one state through the Minnesota Department of Health. And so along the way, there are many stations where either our office or someone in the counties locally are checking to make sure people on the rolls and people voting are the people who should be there. They're eligible to vote in Minnesota. And our record in Minnesota has been really good. Not just my tenure in office, but going back in decades. You really have to say, when you look at the numbers, the incidence of wrongdoing, of criminal behavior, is really, truly microscopic. It's not zero, and no system is perfect. And that's my goal, is zero. I want it to be zero. I think all your viewers do. So there are lapses from time to time, and no system is perfect, but ours is really good. It's clean, it is honest, and we have the record to show it in terms of charges, prosecutions, and the like.
While it is, of course, a felony for a non-citizen to vote, you'd have mentioned that the evidence shows that you don't have a ton of cases of it. Representatives on the fraud committee mentioned that there's no way to retroactively change it. So if someone were to commit a crime and cast a vote, that vote still counts in the election. Is there something else you could do on the front end?
Well, even some of the suggestions that we've heard, even some of the proposals to have things done in a different step of the process, they're not going to get the problem to zero, because inherently it'll probably never be zero. It's never zero in any place that I know of. I think what we always have to do in the system, always, legislators, our office, our county partners, is you always have to try to balance access and security. Those are the two things. If we're designing a system, we want that perfect blend, if such a thing exists, between those two things. I think Minnesota, over the last half century, has mostly got it right. It's a matter of opinion, of course, but we're really in that sweet spot of balancing those two things with security provisions that almost no one other state has, in terms of voting by mail, where it's super, super hard for someone to sort of hijack someone else's vote, to access provisions like the ability to register on the day of the elections. There are always risks, of course, and anything is possible, but Minnesota's election system stacks up extremely, extremely well compared to every single other state in America, and I'm happy with that.
Just getting back to some of the first questions that you were answering, what type of specific interference are you preparing for the potential of from the Trump administration when it comes to the midterms?
Yeah, and again, I want to emphasize, it's not a prediction, but it is a precaution. So it could mean a lot of things. It could mean federal law enforcement personnel in and around polling places. It could mean a last-minute executive order. It could mean interference of some kind with the Postal Service delivering vote by mail. It could mean a lot of things. The only limitation here is our imagination, really. And so, again, not a prediction, but we're working with a lot of partners to try to cover the ground about what might interfere with people's freedom to vote, and to make sure we have a response ready. Sometimes that could be going to court and getting an order. Sometimes that could be something else. But we just want to make sure we're ready for all realistic possibilities. We hope it never happens, and maybe this will be all for nothing, and that's okay. Oftentimes, training is for nothing, in the sense that you train for the power outage and it never happens, or you train for the bomb threat and it never happens. But I'd much rather be in the situation of having trained hard and thought hard about things that don't happen than to be caught flat-footed when something bad does happen.
And then just my last question is, obviously you're running for re-election. So you've been rumored to look at other positions or other higher office. Why did you decide to run for re-election?
I love this job. I love being in the democracy business. It's a particularly challenging time to be in the democracy business right now, but this is a labor of love. I love this. It's in my bones. These election issues are connected to every single other issue, because no matter what issue you care about the most, schools, roads, civil rights, taxes, jobs, all roads lead to the ballot box. And that means we have to have a system that people trust, that delivers fair and honest and accurate elections. That's what we have in Minnesota and have had for a long time. And I love being at the center of this.
Thanks for watching another episode of KARE 11 On the Record. Remember, you can catch us streaming on KARE 11 Plus every Sunday at 8 a.m. and you can find every episode on demand.